at least two objects landed in the field. It sounds like they were doing something there. He described that there was like a pathway between the two objects, the two landed objects, like they were walking back and forth, and they were finding this corn that was peeled. On September 16, 1979, West Albany Township farmer Curtis Olson was out mowing the hay on his Lake City property when he noticed something peculiar. Over in a nearby field, he observed that some of his corn stalks appeared to be damaged. His first thought was that it had to have been done by an animal. Possibly it had bedded down there or was involved in a scuffle that had damaged them. But upon further investigation, he found no trace of an animal. But what he did find left him baffled. Something the Wabasha County Sheriff's Department determined was, quote, unexplainable. Olson, a 26-year-old married father, inspected the damage and discovered that a circle had formed, about 50 feet in diameter, in the neighboring field. Stalks were seemingly flattened in a pattern radiating from the center of the circle. In the center, some corn was missing, which left bare ground, as well as charred stalks. It was as if something had come down from the sky and settled on top of the corn. The closer to the middle of the whatever the something was, the more damage it did, including burning or outright destroying the corn underneath. The corn, looks like when you take a hairdryer and it blows all the hair from the center. Olson told this to Minnesota Post-Bulletin reporter Aleta Freimark. Olson attempted to make sense out of it. He assumed that some type of craft had indeed landed, though certain factors left him questioning on whether or not it was a helicopter, a conventional aircraft, or something not of this world. In the field, Olson found paths leading from the circle to another smaller circle some 18 feet away. So instead of one circle, he now had two. The second circle was only about 30 feet in diameter, and it had no charred or bare areas, almost as if the heat the second one was giving off was not as intense. Along the paths between the circles, it appears people or somebody walked around, Olson noted. Another curious thing he found was that some of the corn ears were peeled back, and the silks were plucked or blown from some of the ears. Either some terrific force of wind actually peeled the corn, or somebody had done it manually, including removing the silks and leaving the corn inside untouched. Why they would do this is anyone's guess. At first I thought it was lightning, Olson told Freimark, adding that he hadn't spent much time in the field since the middle of the previous week, though the peeled ears is what left him scratching his head. He knew the peeled ears could not have been caused by lightning, noting how clean they appeared. Wabasha County Sheriff Robert Locklear went out to the Olson farm to investigate. While he admitted that he didn't know what caused the damage or what could have positioned the corn that way, he did note that, quote, lightning does funny things at funny times. Sheriff Locklear told Freimark that a nuclear or combustion engine would have produced enough heat to char more corn than is evidenced in Olson's field. He also noted that he would not report the incident to UFO investigators until after an extension agent had checked the field and provided some type of explanation. He was expecting one that very afternoon. For those not in the know, an extension agent is employed by the county government to work with farmers to increase crop yields, prevent erosion, eliminate pests, those types of things. In addition to the damaged corn was the tracks. Olson found what he described as a footprint. This was along the pathway leading from one circle to the other. The heel was about 1/2 to 2 inches across, and the toes were about 6 inches across. The footprint did not appear to have been produced by someone wearing a shoe, but rather the person walking was barefoot. He looked for others, but the figure or figures seemed to move around on the corn, which obscured the tracks. The oddest thing was that the foot structure did not appear to be human. It was very strange. Olson also noted that it did not look like a print from any animal on his farm, nor did it look like one of the furry pests that occasionally wandered onto his property. he had no idea who or what produced that print. Sheriff Locklear looked to downplay the print, telling Freimark that he had seen, quote, some kind of mark in the soil, but he believed that the print had been made a week prior to the corn being damaged. How he was able to determine this without actually testing it was never disclosed. Olson told Freimark that in all of his years of farming, he'd never seen anything like it, adding that he neither had the time nor the energy to manufacture a hoax. If he had planned the damage and someone in the community had found out, he'd never live it down. I'd have to hang my head for the rest of my life. That said, Olson was open-minded to the possibility that intelligent life might exist elsewhere in the universe, and might very well be so advanced that they are actually visiting Earth. Why they would want to visit his farm, he had no idea, though he suspected that is most likely what happened. Nothing else made sense to him. A neighbor vouched for Olson, telling Freimark that they probably picked his property because he's well known for being friendly. And had he seen them out there, he would have probably had gone out and chatted with them, something that Olson admitted he probably would have done. I myself believe we've been visited. Other people can draw their own conclusions. On April 1st, 1969, Mr. and Mrs. H.E. Lukes of Adelaide were returning home from a visit to Melbourne in the car and were passing through the road leading from Bordertown to Keith in the east end of the state. It was approximately 11:30 to 12 a.m. They were doing about 45 miles per hour on that lonely track that stretches between the two towns. Given its remoteness and lack of streetlights, it's not uncommon to see people speeding along it, especially in the wee hours of the evening. Mr. Lucas was asleep in the passenger seat, whilst his wife drove. They had been sharing driving duties during the long journey. Suddenly, the quiet evening of driving would turn into something else altogether, as ahead, on the long stretch of road, two figures appeared. They had seemingly emerged from the low mulga bush, which skirts the roadway for miles. The bushes on that stretch vary from about 4 feet to about 8 feet high, and are densely merged with each other. The figures ahead were about 200 feet away when Mrs. Lucas first saw them. They were close together walking. She watched as they ambled across the roadway to the other side. They paid no attention to the oncoming car at all. It was as if they never even heard it. According to Mrs. Lucas, they did not look in either direction, but just slowly went to the other side of the road and disappeared, quote, into the air. Mrs. Lucas observed all this as the car was moving towards them and eventually passed them, just as they reached the opposite side of the roadway. She naturally slowed down and for some reason felt the need to actually stop and get out of the car. She immediately woke her husband and told him what she had just seen. He agreed that it was bizarre. What exactly would two men in black suits be doing out crossing the roadway in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night? The nearest town wasn't for 15 miles, as they were about halfway between the two nearest towns in either direction. If they had emerged from the mulga, they would have had to press through the thick growth, etc., and there would have almost certainly be some trace of them on the roadway, but there was nothing. Mrs. Lucas was adamant the men were, quote, immaculately dressed, wearing pristine, well-fitted black outfits, similar to overalls. They did not appear to be dirty or soiled from pushing through the bush, which they would have had to do if they had come from the mulga. She noted that they were clean-shaven and were not wearing hats, but they were each carrying a little black box, about 12 inches square. It appeared to Lucas like they were talking to each other as they crossed the road. But where did they go, she wondered. She found it odd that there was no rustle of bushes or growth where they had disappeared, which would have been observable had they continued into the bush on the other side. To her, it was as if they had flown away or vanished completely. The Lucases attempted to figure out a logical reason who the men could be and why they were there. Their dress ruled out them being prospectors, surveyors, or hikers. No one would wear such immaculate clean clothes so neatly tailored on such a venture, Mrs. Lucas reasoned. There was nothing to suggest any logical purpose in them being there. They looked so clean and neat, and the black clothes made me feel like they looked like men going to a funeral. I could not see anywhere where they had gone, or even come from. There was no reason for men so dressed to be there at such a time. Completely puzzled, we go back to the car and proceeded on our way home, but we could not erase from our minds the incident and discussed it for days after, until finally a friend suggested we ring you for an explanation, Mrs. Lucas noted. The person she reached out was Fred P. Stone. Stone was a member of the United Flying Objects Phenomenon Investigation Team, which was based out of Australia. He also worked as an editor for the UFO-based magazine, Panorama. He interviewed the couple about the encounter, the details of which he printed in a 1969 issue. If she was hoping that Stone could provide some answers, he was at a loss. What explanation could we give, he remarked in his write-up. Mrs. Lucas was certain that she did not imagine it, nor were they a mirage or a trick of the lights. These were men, and they were very real. Stone did indicate that the area of the encounter was known to UFO investigators. The area around this place has been noted for some considerable time for UFO sightings and vague reports of landings, which have never been able to be investigated due to the reticence of the rural people to talk about them. Too many, they say, have been ridiculed and laughed at, so they prefer to say nothing. One thing is very clear, that contrary to the many stories of other men in black, these two men certainly gave no indication of menacing anyone. Mysterious, true, but as far as the Lucas were concerned, the two men, the Lucases, did not seem to exist. They didn't even take any notice of their car, which could have been driven at a greater speed, as is usually done on that road, and could have, in that short space of time and the little distance between them, ran the men down. For even at that slow speed of travel, they passed the men before they completely reached the gutter on the other side. How can one explain such an incident? It must be one of those cases that one puts into the files as unsolved. One aspect of her story that Stone found interesting was that Lucas indicated that she had felt, quote, completely disturbed since the encounter, and she felt a great desire to get the story across to someone. She described it as a, quote, inward compelling feeling that her sighting was, quote, meant for someone's information. Whenever I come across a case where the date is like April 1st, I usually tend to disregard it. But with regards to this case, because the witnesses had actually reached out to the editor of this magazine, it kind of made me think maybe it was on the up and up. It just happened to fall on that date. A few years ago, I made a video called Strange Men in Black Encounters. And in that video, I talked about all these weird cases where people were driving along in the middle of nowhere, middle of the night, like some back road, farmer's fields type thing, and all of a sudden they come across these men dressed in black suits, carrying suitcases, either walking down the road or walking across the road into like nothingness, like forests, swamps, just really out of place. And when I was reading this magazine recently, I was shocked to find this case in there, because it just lined up so perfectly with all these other cases where people see these men in black on back roads in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, total darkness. There was even that a few years ago, there was that thing that happened in, I think it was Vermont, where people were seeing all these men dressed in black suits walking up and down the highways. It was all over the news for a while. So I was filming down there, and I heard snoring in the background.
That's probably the bear.